Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to all those who have joined us today here. I thank you, BIC, for organizing and facilitating this event for us. We are starting today's event, and I'm here to give you a brief idea about how we are going to take the conversation forward in next 1.5 hours. We have Rogier van den Berg, Global Director, World Resources Institute, here with us today, who will share his thoughts on climate action for cities. Before that, what I'm going to do is just give you a bit of context of why we are here today, in what context we will be setting today's conversation. Many of you are probably aware that Bangalore is currently in the process of making a climate action plan for the city. This has started late in 2021 with BBMP being the anchor agency for preparation of this plan. And we at WRI India are working as a knowledge partner with BBMP in preparation of this plan. We have around 25 plus agencies being coordinated and sharing their data and insights in preparation of this plan, because when we talk about climate action, it cuts across multiple sectors in both space and their initiatives. All right. So Bangalore has actually joined the C40 Cities Network in 2017, and not only because of that fact, but also the kind of climate-related stress we are seeing in the city, it makes this conversation all the more contextual and imperative to have at this point. When we talk about cities today, cities across the globe, especially the one in the global south and in the developing economies, are in a tight spot. So there is this whole agenda of attending 1.5 degrees, which is also coming from the whole Paris Agreement, in which Bangalore itself becomes a signatory the moment it is part of the C40 Cities Network. On the other hand, there is this whole challenge of human development and extending quality of life services to all its population. And hence all the cities, including Bangalore, are walking this tightrope of balancing these two aspirations, being climate progressive, meeting its global commitments, and at the same time, maintaining and enhancing its quality of life for its people. Now, what does a CAP really do? It has these dual objectives. On one hand, to mitigate the greenhouse gas emissions, which we call the mitigation story of a climate action plan, in which it has certain commitments, and on the other hand, to build resilience against climate change impacts that the city is facing already and is likely to face in the future. Now, what does a climate action plan do is to set out a pathway for future so that a city can somewhat balance and walk this tightrope. Now, how we are doing in Bangalore at this point. And you can see this image playing out on your screen. This is probably a much watched image which has been put on social media, etc. This is how our city grew from between 1990 to 2015, and we have seen a 170% increase in the city's built-up footprint. This is corresponding to a population growth almost in the same corresponding matching years of around 90%, and a subsequent decline in the city's green cover and water bodies. And the impact is for all of us to see. Now, in terms of when we talk about greenhouse gas, which is the main concern on the mitigation story of the climate action plan, and as a part of the climate action planning process, which currently we are involved in, spearheaded by BBMP, a first time a GHG inventory for Bangalore has been made, and these are some interim results that we are showing you here. The GHG footprint for the BBMP area for three major sectors, which according to the global protocol for GHG emission assessment at a city level, stands at 18.7 million metric tons for BBMP area for three sectors for 2019. 2019 being pegged as the baseline year here to avoid any COVID-related externalities that might have happened in the later years like 2020, 21, and so on. And as you can see, the stationary energy sector is the biggest contributor. This is both stationary energy and buildings, followed by transportation, followed by waste sector, which combines both solid waste and liquid waste management. Yes. Now, what is going to happen in future if we are emitting this much today? How we are placed for the future? So, our analysis show that in a business as usual scenario, which is basically a do nothing scenario as per the technical terminologies we are following, it is going to go up to almost, close to about threefolds in 2050. And if we are able to actually manage and achieve our existing and planned policies, I'm not talking about any ambitious policy, just what is existing and planned, this is likely to be 26.6. We are likely to emit around 26.6 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2050. We definitely need to do more. This is not enough. If we talk about just a glimpse of the sector-wise contributors to this projected GHG emissions, you can see the sector-wise shares are going to be almost the same. It's just that because the population will grow, because the economy and activities will grow, we will continue to emit more and more, the sectoral share almost remaining the same. Now coming to the adaptation and resilience side of the climate change story, and that is where we see that there are majorly 5 types of climate-related hazards that has been identified for Bangalore, and you can see on screen, this is not something that as citizens of Bangalore, many will be surprised about. But just wanted to flag here that apart from climate stress, one of the other environment-related hazards that we are already facing in all cities, including Bangalore, is the air pollution story, which is closely connected to the climate change mitigation story because the sources of air pollution and GHG are more or less the same. And hence, the moment we manage one part of it, the other part comes as a co-benefit. And this is just to show you one map, because we have been talking about the flood story, everybody is aware of this. Heat stress for a city like Bangalore is going to emerge as one of the future areas of concern. The red and orange patches you are seeing in the periphery of this map of BBMP are the areas which are facing more than above average temperatures during the summer months, and you can also correlate this to availability of green spaces. You can see the city score where we have something like a Cubbon Park and Alsur Lake, etc. The incidence of patches are really lesser than the periphery of the city, and we are because the outer areas of Bangalore have grown in a way which is sort of unplanned, and we have not been able to make enough green interventions there. So this is what we are seeing. This is another aspect of the whole climate action, resilience building. So when, say, a climate-related disaster or hazard strikes, how as a city we are prepared? And there are a plethora of maps and analysis that has been done. This is just one example. This is the access to hospitals in Bangalore. Now, this is, as you see, this is including both government and private hospitals, the access story. Around 89% of the city's population has access within a standard response time of 10 minutes. This is the next map. If we just replace this all hospitals to only government hospital story, the access story changes. It drops to around 32% of the city's population has access to a government hospital within 10 minutes of its reach. Yes, so we are looking at all the 7 sectors in terms of action framing, and this has been placed in a scale sort of mitigation and adaptation. It is not to say that one sector only focuses on mitigation and there is no requirement for adaptation and resilience building in that, but it is just to say that how they weigh in terms of both the mitigation and adaptation side of climate action planning. With the local context, I invite Rogier on stage. Rogier will present on the global context and learnings from this experience in other cities on climate action planning. Welcome, Rogier.
Thank you, Shri. You talked way too short. Now they have to listen to me. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the Bangalore International Center for hosting us on a very important discussion. I'm very eager to share with you some takeaways from COP27 and having a look at 2023. What are we going to do and what's needed in terms of climate action? Before I was with WRI, I was with UN Habitat, working in many places in the world, also in India. It's not the first time that I'm here, so if you think that I'm naive, then please tell me, because then probably I haven't seen the right thing in the right way. Nevertheless, I try to link on what is the global conversation to what we're seeing here and some of the things that Shri talked about. So 5 priorities for urban climate action in 2023. This is where we work. WRI, the Ross Center for Sustainable Cities, we're with almost the Ross Center only, so that is focused on cities. We are with around 500 people, 500 professionals, an NGO, a non-profit, a think and do tank. So we develop research in order to shift agendas and to contribute to thought leadership on climate, human well-being and economy. At the same time, we really work on the ground to figure out first practice. How do you get it done? Because that is difficult enough. So, and we try to link those. So we are part of a global conversation. We are part of a conversation with the national authorities on policies, and we are part of action on the ground. And the good thing is that we do the cities work, but we are part of WRI, which has much more expertise on water, on climate, on economy, on finance that we can tap into. So I was at COP, I don't know, just checking, who was in Sharm el-Sheikh, who is in this audience? Nobody? That is very good, because otherwise, if everybody would have been there, you know, I kind of avoid kind of repeating some messages. But I think very important thing is that before Sharm el-Sheikh, we issued and we released a report, the State of Climate Action 2022, and it doesn't look good. And we all know that, but none of the 40 indicators to achieve net zero, to stay under 1.5 degrees, we are either not on track, we are far off track, or we're actually going in the wrong direction. To give you an example, in terms of transportation, we need to go six times faster, which actually means 6 times faster from the baseline, which actually means that we need to double rapid transport infrastructure by 2030 relative to 2021. That's globally. Huh? Same counts for building. Huge opportunity for decarbonizing cities, decarbonizing the world sits in buildings, as we heard already from Shri. We need to go 5 to 7 times faster. So it's really, really serious issues here at stake in terms of on how we accelerate climate action. Same counts for the reduction of the percentage of kilometers traveled by passengers. So even if we achieve the electrification of cars, we are not there yet. We also need to reduce the amount of vehicle kilometers traveled. We need to prioritize active mobility. We need to provide opportunities to find services and opportunities in the proximity of where people live. Same counts for the reduction of the share of unabated fossil gas in electricity generation. That goes completely in the wrong direction. Don't worry, I stop here. You know, I would advise you, for if you're interested, to look at the State of Climate Action, because it's very practical. Where are we? In which direction are we currently going? And what do we need to do to achieve and to halve emissions by 2030? And that's only, can you imagine, half emissions by 2030 is now we're starting 2023. We have a big opportunity here, and it is actually the cities, and I'm not going to go through all these points here, but as many of you know, cities are responsible for two-thirds of the greenhouse gas emissions globally. Not only within their municipal boundaries, but also in for example, the supply chains that they drive. So 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. So cities are a key. So you cannot resolve the climate crisis without resolving cities properly. And that's quite complex, because it needs the national authorities to take cities on board and to say city practice and city policy as part of their national climate agenda. And it requires negotiation, collaboration, and that requires what we call multi-level governance. So you need to bring different stakeholders at different levels of authority together. A very good thing what happened at COP27, for the first time there was an urban ministerial. There were 40 national delegations under the COP27 presidency talking about the relevance of cities. And I hear you thinking, yeah, talking, there's nothing done. But it is very important. It's very important that national authorities really step up their game if it comes down to cities action, and see it as an integral part of their national climate agenda. So that's a good thing that happened. And I really want to make sure that we leave here the room not seeing cities as the problem. Cities are the solution. You can look at cities as a congestion of people and activities, but exactly the concentration of people and activities offer us the opportunity to decarbonize at scale. We also see that there's a deep and growing inequity. Inequity has moved to the city, with large shares within city boundaries, globally, in India, in Africa, in Latin America, in the US, in Europe. A big distinction between the have and the have-nots if it comes down to how they can bank and how they can actually profit and prosper from tapping into what we call the urban dividend. The agglomeration offers you services, offers you opportunities. But if it's because you're living too far away from them and you cannot access them, the city is not an opportunity. So we have to kind of reverse that. We have to change that. We have to accelerate implementation and make sure that cities are helping us to achieve our climate agenda. So I'm going to tell you five things that really came from the discussions at COP, where we see topics and challenges emerge, and also try to be practical to say, what does it actually mean in the context of India, Bangalore, or what does it mean in the context of other geographies? And one is to integrate climate goals in all key urban decisions. And I already talked a little bit about multi-level governance. So it means climate is not a separate agenda. Climate cuts across different departments, infrastructure. It relates to different sources of resources. So it comes down to what we're doing with nature. It comes down to what we're doing with the infrastructure, how we govern our places, and so forth and so forth. So it's a sticky issue, and we can only address it if we engage in strategic planning. And it can only work if we also address financial process, and I'm going to say something about that. The whole decarbonization issue is very obsessed with technology and innovation. There's nothing wrong with that. But the best way to think and to look at climate action in cities is looking at land use and land use management. We've seen historically in all the cities in the world that there is a tendency to grow in a very low dense fashion. And that's extremely costly in terms of infrastructure provision per capita. So we need to change that. I'm not saying that we need to live in cities with endless towers and high density and unlivable realities, but a good compact city layout can really help us to achieve the climate agenda, but can also help people to have much more and easier access to services, live in the proximity to schools, and so forth. So what does it mean, integrating climate goals in all key urban decisions? It needs us to, and a good example, and we've seen Shri talking about the Bangalore Climate Action Plan. We have the experience with the Mumbai Climate Action Plan, is that we really look at the municipal budget from a lens of climate action and climate finance. It means that we can help cities to tag the municipal budget for what do we see as potential opportunities to contribute to the climate action, but also where we see the opportunity to increase investment or to kind of change the way that we invest. How do we bring the garden department, the infrastructure department, public space and housing department together, and how we utilize the resources that are actually available for the next years in order to achieve the climate agenda? The other thing is that the sticky issue of climate being a cross-cutting issue. That means that we need to bring departments together. In the Mumbai Action Plan, we utilized the climate action cell. We developed the climate action cell. And that's a very interesting opportunity. That's the opportunity to bring the different departments together, but also an opportunity for creating a dock for external services and to make sure that they are not a one-off, but they drive a capacity building process within cities and municipalities. And very important that we create an ecosystem of partners. A continuous dialogue with NGOs, with the private sector, with the municipal authorities and the private sector and financing institutions is key. So this is about what we call this kind of multi-level integrated action. We launched a new integrated climate action program at COP27 to answer the demand for this and the need for this, and are supporting a few cities in achieving this. One of them is Bangalore and the Mumbai. And so then the next step, of course, is if you achieve this in one city, how can we scale it? And how can we create, as much as possible, rapid versions of this first practice? And I think this is very important on how we work as WRI supporting cities, is really figuring out first practice. How do you get it done? And then figuring out what are the scaling mechanisms to scale to tier 1, tier 2 cities across a state, across a national landscape. The second point is to make buildings efficient and resilient. The energy crisis in Europe and elsewhere caused Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. That led to a renewed focus from the European Union and other governments on policies and incentives to curb surging energy prices. So there's a lot of investment and a lot of money going into curbing energy prices and actually subsidizing fossil fuel. And we need to really look at the energy efficiency part of it. So we cannot only look at the supply side, we need to look at the demand side of energy as well. And buildings, they play a key role in that. Buildings are really the biggest bang for the buck. Shri already told you, in any city in the world, around 60% of the greenhouse gases come from the building sector. Around 20% come from transport and mobility, 15% from materials, and 5% from waste. It will, of course, change a little bit according to the city, according to geography, but really focusing on the building sector is key for decarbonizing city, and that energy efficiency part is key within the building sector, as well as reducing embodied carbon and driving circularity. And we are doing that with WRI. We have a program that's called the Zero Carbon Building Accelerator to accelerate zero carbon buildings in cities and help national authorities to carve out pathways, how to transform the building sector. One example is in Colombia, for example, where we really worked with the national authorities to set new building codes to make sure that all new buildings are energy efficient. And that really helps to decarbonize and to achieve kind of the national climate agenda at scale. And we're also working on this issue with the local authorities in India. The third is to decarbonize transportation. Shri already talked about it. So how do we get that done? And what we've seen, and actually in the COP before Sharm, the COP in Glasgow, we were a bit disappointed because WRI, the Ross Center, emerged from what used to be called Embark, a very specialized NGO on transport and mobility. And we were a little bit disappointed in Glasgow that the obsession with the electrification of vehicles, while decarbonizing transportation with public transportation, decarbonizing transportation with supporting active mobility, walking and cycling in city, is way much cheaper and offers so many benefits. So first on the agenda is to organize high quality public transport. And I see a lot of countries and cities, but I've never been, in the last days, I've seen the infrastructure investment going on here in Bangalore, in Mumbai, and I will see other investment going on in Delhi by tomorrow, the day after. An immense opportunity, but you cannot bank on that infrastructure investment only. You need to connect it clearly to its surroundings. So how do you think about first and last mile connectivity? How do you create a transit-oriented development around the stations so that people can easily access and that you can really pump up the ridership of these very expensive pieces of infrastructure? Very important that I told you already in the beginning that with the electric vehicles obsession, you will not make it in terms of the climate agenda globally, locally and nationally. You have to do more. You have to reduce the vehicle meters travel. You have to look at active mobility. And the good thing about active mobility is that green mobility, public transportation, active mobility is a huge opportunity to address other sticky issues, annoying issues, quality of life issues that citizens face. Congestion, pollution, noise, inefficiency. The green mobility entry point helps us to really resolve this, to create healthier, safer neighborhoods, and even to drive municipal finance by creating, by even increasing municipal finance, and you see it by creating and having extra fair revenues, for example. So that green mobility as an entry point is very important. This is an example. This is kind of more of a conceptual model. In Brazil, in Brazilian cities, we're working closely with the cities in Brazil to really look at each of these interventions, because there is no silver bullet. We look at each of these interventions, contributing and aggregating them into a layer of the city that is attractive for active mobility, that is safe to walk, and that creates also attractive public spaces. And we are involved as WI very much in doing this work, creating this first practice, doing that work on the opening up and making the attraction to public spaces bigger, making public spaces accessible, making public spaces safe. So that is a very important, carving out the opportunity of public spaces in cities with all these benefits is a very important contributor to this kind of transportation agenda. And it doesn't come for free. It's somehow weird. I've been always surprised. It's somehow weird that we are discussing the huge amount of resources that need to go into a metro system, in huge investment going from the airport over the ring roads to the south of Bangalore, and why it's so difficult to discuss the investment in active mobility. Because it's actually a relative modest investment, but it costs money. And together with the World Bank, we have been developing this practice paper on how cities can invest, and it's available online, how cities can invest for this momentum in active mobility, and where the resources can come from, because they don't come from one resource. There's different opportunities to utilize resources at the local, national, international, and with the private sector. And then the aggregation. So don't get me wrong. I was a little bit bashing the obsession with the electrification of vehicles. And I need to be very careful because we have a great team in WI that is really helping this transition. And it's very important, but it's not the only thing. One thing, aggregation of demand is very important to change the marketplace. We have been supporting in the Grand Challenge, Indian cities in the Grand Challenge for deployment of e-buses, aggregating the demand from the 9 largest cities. And with that, having the largest e-bus procurement of almost 6,000 e-buses done, and with that reducing the price for buses by 30%, and really having a huge influence on how do you create a connectivity of the different, or how do you determine the specifications of these buses and the infrastructure that you need. We're now in the process of supporting the national authorities in aggregating demand and the standardization and specializations for 50,000 e-buses. So that's really making change at scale. The fourth, bridge the urban services and housing divide. We have been working for 6 years almost with WRI on a piece of research on the urban services divide, looking out actually how unequal cities are and how there is the gap between the have and the have-nots is growing. And we also came with a capstone report on what are the 7 transformations for more equitable and sustainable cities that we need to look into if we want to close that urban services divide. And I already told you that, that urban service divide is really going to limit everything in the cities that we want to achieve. If you keep out half of the urban population in a city that is growing, and if you keep them out in your agenda, in your action agenda, they cannot contribute, they cannot prosper, and we are looking into very severe challenges in the future. So we worked on this for 6 years. This is a super important piece of work that you need to translate in actual agenda. And can you do it. And I think the slide is a little vague. This is actually a map of the world showcasing our prize for cities. The prize for cities that we have, it's the third cycle right now. The prize for cities is a yearly prize that we launch it's a yearly prize for cities that we have, that every year we receive around 260 submissions of successful urban transformations, of cities that have been successful in transforming really for the long term their cities. And this year we have 5 finalists in Colombia, in Paris, in Pakistan, in India, the Urban Wage Employment Initiative in India, and in the Philippines. And I wanted to show this example because how do we deal with inequality? How do we deal with informal settlements? And can we finance in situ upgrading of informal settlements in cities? And we have good examples, and one of them is in Iloilo City, where through long-term engagement with the communities and through long-term engagement with the municipal authorities and NGOs, in Iloilo City, they have been able to resettle within the city limits, but also they have been able to bring almost 5,000 households in a program to access housing finance. And that is very important, to work with the communities, look at in situ upgrading, and as such not relocating people far from where they have their livelihoods. So the fourth, and I don't know if I can go back before I come to my last point, looking and bridging the urban services and housing divide, looking at land tenure, as I showed with the Iloilo example, looking at the access to finance and integrated spatial planning. How can we really look in the upgradation of informal settlements and making them part of formal planning process of the municipal authorities? That brings me to my last point as a takeaway from COP and as a look at 2023, to build climate resilience with water and nature at the center. Water is the scarce resource already for cities, and this is only going to increase. So if we don't take the water challenge seriously, we're looking into a humanitarian challenge for cities in the future. How do we address it? How do we look at the green-blue infrastructure in cities as a solution for too much, too little, and polluted water? How do we reduce heat stress in cities by increasing tree cover, by increasing vegetation? That's one of the big challenges of our time. The question is, how do we finance it? It's very challenging. We have experience in setting up a large fund for 100 African cities. And what we've seen there is that we need to look in opportunities to fund high-impact, low-investment, nature-based solutions. A lot of the investment and funding opportunities that are around in this world and at the national level look at investments of $50 to $100 million at least. While there's a huge amount of green-blue infrastructure investment that are small, but are very impactful at the neighborhood level. For example, household level rainwater harvesting, nature-based solutions for stormwater management, of nature-based solutions for wastewater management. So how to finance them and how to aggregate the opportunity of investing in multiple of these solutions in the city is something that we need to look into and accelerate. And locally led adaptation, one example of that is that we spearheaded here with WRI India is the Urban Community Resilience Assessment. So really work with community to identify their vulnerabilities and see what is the low-hanging fruit to resolve it, and to make everybody aware what the challenges are, and invest in community infrastructure to make sure that they're safe and timely informed. Last thing that I want to say, that opportunity and the challenge of nature-based solutions, that blue-green infrastructure in cities, it's very difficult to get it financed right. But cities are advancing, and therefore we developed a platform. It's called Cities for Forest, and Kochi, Hyderabad, and Mumbai are also part of that. Now it includes 86 cities in the network. in which the experiences of financing nature-based solutions are shared. And that's another way of learning, another way of scaling across cities, because cities learn the most when they learn from each other. And I wanted to end with this kind of a funny slide. What if it's a hoax and we create livable cities, have no air pollution, healthy children, clean water, and good air to breathe? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Roger, for the excellent presentation. With this, we move on to the next segment of this event, and I request Ravi to please take a seat on the stage. And I also request Jaya Dhindaw, Director of the Integrated Urban Development Practice at WRI India. So Ravi, along with Roger and Jaya, will engage in a conversation. And I also have an announcement that Srimati Gunjan Krishna, Commissioner Industries Department, she has sent her apologies that due to a last-minute call from the Secretariat and the meeting, she couldn't make it here. We are nevertheless going to try and going to turn this exciting for you, but I saved that for Ravi. Ravi, over to you. Thank you.
So I think Sri doesn't want to give the spoiler on how we'll try and make it exciting. Thank you for being here. Roger, that was a great presentation. The question I have for you, and I want to try and make this discussion among us a lot more rooted in the ground specific stuff that we can do, because the whole thing is really structured around a climate action plan, and specifically what does it mean for Bangalore within the larger context of how it works for cities around the world. So in your view, which city is there in the world today, or a set of cities, that have already got in place a great city action plan, and which has some of the characteristics of the Indian marketplace, which is a large set of silos of government agencies, a governance system that's a bit weak, not a very developed economy? Are there examples in the world where on the climate action plan journey, they have got going?
Yeah, so there...
You need to use the mic. So. Yes, it's on. It's on.
I think there are multiple cities with good climate action plans. We've collaborated with our friends organization C40, as many of you know, on developing them. I just wanted to say, if I look at what has been achieved here in India with the Mumbai Climate Action Plan, for example, I'm really impressed, because having a climate action plan, Berg, Johannesburg is a very good climate action. Having a climate action plan is great, but now it's all about, as I said, accelerating the actual implementation.
Right.
So the climate action plan, such as in Johannesburg, is great. Nevertheless, we can only see if it's successful if the implementation mechanisms are there, and if we really kind of roll out what we looked at achieving.
So in the Mumbai Action Plan, because that's in the country, what elements of it have you liked so far? Because the plan is out there. So was it the process of putting the plan together, the elements in it? What is it that appeals to you? Because I know there's still execution and a lot of ground to cover, but what appeals to you at this point of time?
Well, so I mentioned that before, I think what is very potential that we have done in the Mumbai Climate Action Plan is helping the city to tag the municipal budget. I really think that sounds like a bureaucratic exercise, and it is to a certain extent, but it's highly effective. So, because if we think about climate action as a separate thing to finance, it becomes very complex. There are elements, yeah, but there's a lot of infrastructure investment taking place that you can adapt and amend in order to make it kind of climate proof. That is one thing. And the other thing that I explained briefly is the setup of this kind of the climate action cell, where you create a mechanism to bring different departments, different actors within the bureaucracy together in order to make sure that you cut the big issues across the different mandates of bureaucrats and decision makers, but also that you create the opportunity to bring in external expertise, because you cannot expect a municipality to have all the expertise in-house. So you need a mechanism to kind of bring that in, but not as a one-off, to really use it as a capacity building mechanism. I really see this as two innovations that have happened here
So
in
just
India,
staying
in
with that
Mumbai.
innovation, so in Mumbai, where is it anchored, this climate action plan? Is it with the Mumbai Municipal Corporation or is it with the Urban Development Department? Where is it anchored?
Jaya, can you be more specific on that?
It is with the Mumbai Municipal Corporation, actually. It is anchored within that. There's a climate action cell that has been created as part of this whole exercise. And their central job is to basically coordinate across all the agencies.
Okay. I'll come back to that. So Roger, coming back to your presentation, among the 5 examples that you had, the winning examples, so the Colombia, you have awarded somebody where you have really called out the mayor's office. So what was special about the mayor's office in the context of this whole climate action discussion that made it particularly a standout applicant among the 5 that got shortlisted?
The one on the
In
prize,
Colombia,
on
yeah.
the prize for cities.
Yeah.
Yeah. What is interesting about the prize for cities, and especially of the one in Colombia, because you specifically asked, it's called Todos al Parque. And what they did in that transformative project is they started to Barranquilla is the city. Barranquilla, really after the port kind of deteriorated, the city really was not attractive anymore, really in a very bad state. And they started to bit by bit develop an approach to public space rejuvenation, bringing different communities together around creating public spaces, green spaces in the city. Now, having been able to provide access to a good green space within 5 minutes walk for everyone in Barranquilla. And the success of that story is that they did it over 3 or 4 terms, political terms. So this sustained an approach that started as a placemaking approach, scaled it to a citywide strategy, and then started to understand that it was not only a physical intervention, but that it was a way to regain trust in the authorities and the local authorities, and which the result is actually that the manager of that program became the mayor, and now it's not only a technical program, it's not only a community program, it's a political program.
That's fascinating. Moving on to the second example, the 15-minute city, Paris. There's a lot of talk, because you talk about active mobility, living and working close by so that you don't need to travel long distances. Which cities are taking initiatives in making this 15-minute city kind of concept? Because this is a retrofit. It's an existing city and you got to make it work where 90% of your work gets done within a 15-minute radius.
Yeah.
So which cities are taking the lead there, and what's the early experience of that? Because if you're going to really reduce this transportation footprint, this will be a big part of making that happen.
Yeah, I see. I mean, I see the cities actually, you wouldn't expect, but some cities in the US have been quite successful in applying this 15-minute city. And I think there's quite a few architects and planners here in the audience. The 15-minute city is, of course, not a new thing. Eh? Right. We already knew a long time ago about it. The success of the 15-minute city, the way that it's been framed, and we had a discussion today in the office that for a long time we've talked a little bit too much about density, creating densities. That is not a very attractive concept. The 15 minutes is a concept that talks about access to urban services. As I explained, we've done the studies on kind of access to urban services. That 15-minute city kind of reframes the compact city in a way. And in that sense, I think is one of the most successful advocacy and one of the most successful framings that helped us to advocate for the walkable, the cyclable, and the city in the proximity. You see it applied now in many cities in Europe. You see it apply now actually in few places that we are working in African cities, in Addis Ababa, where we're working together with the authorities on creating safe and active mobility on the ground. In Latin America, it's really spreads. I mean, there's multiple cities
Got it. So just staying with the 15-minute city or the 5-kilometer city, whichever way you want to look at it, any interesting examples on how social housing has been provided within this compact city? Because I think one of the important things really is the entire support services, etc., that are required for households and commercial enterprises, they need to come from the same geography. Because if you're going to transport them from 30, 40 kilometers away, again, you've lost the battle. So are there any interesting examples on social rental housing or where you can do this on scale across communities so that the entire community is staying together within a very compact area?
Yeah, well, the other
Need to
finalist.
just hold
Oh,
this.
sorry. The other finalist of the prize, the example that I gave from Iloilo City in the Philippines, is really a good example because you're really talking about 1,000 households that are relocated in their own district or actually in their own ward, upgrading their housing with working with them and providing the actual financial resources to do it successfully. And we see, and this is why it's a prize for cities finalists, because there is a huge opportunity with the experience there to scale it across multiple cities. So other examples, and for everybody who's interested, our World Resources Report has a couple of in-depth studies on how housing projects in different cities have been successful in doing this. But at the moment, I find the Iloilo example in the context of Asia one of the most interesting and appealing.
So, I mean, the new target, I think, after COP27 is net zero by 2070. I think India is now a signatory for the... So the advantage of being 2070 is I'm ready to sign anywhere.
Yeah.
So specifically, you had this chart on the percentage. I think Sri first put up the chart. I was always under the impression, you mentioned building. I thought the biggest contributor really was energy, 65% or 70% of this overall fix, and the movement away from fossil fuels. So consequently, there's a whole lot of interest in, basically could be EV, or now they're talking about green hydrogen and renewables and the like. If we have to do a ABC analysis of the solution ahead, would energy markers be the most important ones to work on? Of course, I know we need to work on multiple fronts, but in energy, what is a low-hanging fruit to work with?
I mean, well, you sketched it quite well. I mean, on one hand, you have the demand side. On the other hand, the supply side. I talked a little bit about the energy crisis and how actually upset we are also a little bit. On one hand, the European Union is doing great in supporting its citizens in capping consumer energy bills. But that's really only working on the supply side. So if we don't enter in the demand side, and buildings is part of it, and when I say buildings, the energy efficiency, then I mean the biggest contributor is the energy efficiency of buildings. So this is really where we need to work on, but you cannot work on it if the grid is dirty. You of course have.
So when you say efficiency, it's cooling and heating,
Yes.
use of material.
Exactly.
Stuff like-
It's and especially cooling and heating. That's really the biggest cooling, heating, retrofitting, insulation. That's really the biggest bang for the buck. And it's interesting to see that cities. That is interesting. So I talked a lot about multi-level governance, the need for building codes, but cities have an important role to play in accelerating that retrofitting of buildings because it relates to the permits that you have at hand. It relates to the companies because a lot of that retrofitting work is not done by huge conglomerates. It's done by small and medium enterprises. One interesting thing is about that energy the energy opportunity and energy efficiency is that it's not only this, the moral right thing to do, but it's a smart thing to do because transforming buildings in becoming energy efficient building is really one of the biggest job providers that you have at hand. So
it's an employment generator. Also.
Exactly, it's an employment generator, and decision makers in the city are extremely excited about generating employment and jobs.
Jaya, I'll come to you later, but let me get this train of thought done. Sure. Moving on to transportation, I read somewhere, I think Copenhagen has one of the lowest private car ownership, 25%. Bangalore is 110 or 120% motor vehicle ownership. So the challenge here, I see it as being twofold, and what's been your experience? One is, of course, you need this mass transit and buses and all that on scale to happen. But you also need a consumer mindset shift that I will take the public transport over my private vehicle. So what's the challenge here? Because clearly the modal share of the mass transit or the buses, etc., needs to be around 70-75%, give or take a few percentage. But we are nowhere near that, and it's getting worse. So any interesting ways to do that by which you get this shift to happen?
I think, it's never a silver bullet. but there's an important, on one hand, what we've experienced is that advocacy and working with cities in really making public transit accessible, but also making it attractive. So that is one thing that campaigning actually helped a lot. We've seen during COVID that actually we saw that suddenly things were possible that we would never thought.
But it was also not a good time for public transport, unfortunately.
No, for public transport not, but for active mobility it has been. Yeah, I think a very important what we see that was extremely important success story for successful public transport uptake and usage is to the last mile connectivity. So if you make it easy for people to take a mode of transport to the station area and as such kind of jump into a train, I think that's one of the most successful opportunities that we have at hand to let more people make use of it.
Any suggestions when the infrastructure is stressed, which doesn't allow the last mile connectivity? Because many of our metro stations in Bangalore, the ability to park, get off a thing and get onto the thing itself is pretty stressed. You're doing that on the main road and consequently backing up traffic. So are there been any innovative ways to do this inter-transfers and where you're land constrained? Because I think we seem to have that problem in Bangalore.
Yeah. Now, where you're land constrained, I think it comes down to a pretty challenging but also interesting design challenge. How do you organize the spatial domain around station in the most efficient and sophisticated way, which requires kiss and ride opportunities, which requires opportunities for active mobility, for safe crossings. When you're space constrained, it becomes difficult, for example, to introduce parking. But we've seen that has been quite successful in work that have been doing in the past in San Francisco Bay Area, for example, where you create integrated tickets between the parking lots for cars and the train tickets. Those are successful combinations that you can develop.
Okay. This whole mitigation activity, I mean, I read an estimate that India, to meet its net zero by 2070, will need $100 billion per year on year, to get there. So let's just talk financing. I mean, these are non-trivial numbers, and also in a system which is not very efficient in the way capital gets used in the public space. So what have been the innovative financing models, public and private, which has got some traction for addressing the climate issue?
Well, I think there maybe you can say three things are extremely important. It's the opportunity to aggregate demand. This is something that we've seen, for example, in the EV bus project.
What you saw there, yeah.
Aggregating demand so that what seems to be small, you scale and then becomes a very serious opportunity for large-scale investment. And because there's not a lack of financing, it's only very difficult to let the finance flow to the right places. The second is really to help cities to identify projects and to create a citywide approach to project and pipeline development, so that if you want to transform cities, a systems transformation is key. We should really be careful doing pilot by pilot by pilot by pilot. One of the examples, and I refer to it briefly, is the work that we've been doing in African cities to create a catalytic fund that on one hand helps cities to identify actionable projects, aggregate them, and then create the matchmaking between the projects and existing international funding opportunities. There's a lot of climate finance around. It doesn't find its way to actual project in cities. And the last is creating an opportunity for bringing guarantees in order to make it much more attractive for the private sector. So a lot of the solutions that we're talking about, for example, and nature-based solutions, there is even a business case for some of the nature-based solutions, but the private sector is pretty wary, and this is where the international community and the international banks can come in that have the opportunity to provide guarantees in order to lower the risk or take away the risk for the private sector to come in. And that's really the only way with the private
So
sector.
they would take away the risk by what? Being a lender of the last resort, or
being a lender of the last resort, providing kind of first loss guarantee. You are enabled to try it a few times and fail, because we cannot accept that we kind of figure it out on paper and then at once it is well done. So I think those are very important mechanisms that we see emerge right now. And maybe the last thing that we are interested lately in and that we're exploring with cities and other organizations is to have a better understanding, to quantify the investment potential of policy reform. At the COP and at many of the discussions that we're having, the cities often talk about the private sector as them. We need them. They need to come and invest. But there are policies and land use opportunities that for which cities have the mandate and in which cities have the opportunity to enforce, in which there is an investment. There is a business case for a zero emission zone, which attracts investment from the private sector. So kind of bringing policy reform and private sector investment closer together, much more as a package, as teaming up together, there's a huge opportunity for.
And who takes the leadership to make this happen at a city level?
But the city itself, the mandated department, the city leaders, they are really on the ball for making this happen. And they cannot do it alone. And as I said in the beginning of my speech, is that a lot of the decisions and a lot of the work that cities cannot do without national support in terms, sometimes it's at policy level, sometimes it's at the finance level, but also even if a city identifies a great project for investment and you are able to pool money maybe from the Green Climate Fund, you still need national authorities to provide you, for example, sovereign guarantee. So you cannot do without the blessing and the collaboration of national authorities. And this is why this urban ministerial that I was talking about in my speech, the urban ministerial that happened at COP, was not only a talk shop, it was very important to have 40 national delegates talk about the importance of cities. And as such, we are able to help to establish those relationships.
So in the same, sounds very Herculean and difficult at one level. At an individual level or at a local community level, because you also mentioned that that's another way to go, what is it that they can do? I mean, we as individuals or within the local community, where we take ownership, what are the kind of things, and are there any examples where there's change which is happening bottom up while the powers that be decide how they're going to get to net zero over the next 50 years?
Behavioral change, behavioral change, that is the biggest opportunity. If we all start to, if 1 out of each 3 trips we decide to take the public transport, walk, biking here still, I'm a Dutchman, so I've seen that it's not so easy in a city as Bangalore. But if we do 1 out of 3 trips, we do this. If we change our behavior, we can really unlock enormous change. So it's us here that can help to achieve the global climate agenda. We are key to it.
So just last question, moving on to the adaptation or the resilience, building in resilience. You're from Amsterdam, where parts of Amsterdam are predicted to go underwater. It's a matter of time, along with Venice and a few other places. So, and Bangalore flooding, I think, and it was there in the chart too. We have already had 2 incidents of flooding last year, and I think is the #1 risk for Bangalore. So what would be good mitigation measures when you're looking at, let's say, an issue of flooding per se in an urban context? And somewhere I also read, this is more an aggregate statistics, that across cities, the stormwater drain is effective only to the extent of 30 to 50% of what it should be, either by connectivity or it's got sewage or whatever. So what's the kind of resilience measure to make sure that you don't have another urban flooding situation when the rains get bad?
I think there's different measures, but I think important is that for decades, we have been obsessed with engineering and concrete. And that works to a certain extent, but really looking at much more soft measures, nature-based solutions that I was talking about, to create much more absorption potential. If you talk specifically about flooding, to create inundation areas, absorption areas that can capture the water instead of underground tanks, you can create with good landscapes and with more vegetation, you can do a lot. And it's not only the big parks and the big nature-based solutions for stormwater management. You can also provide incentives to businesses and house owners to support in the way that they treat their environment to make it more, to create more absorption capacity. I think aggregating at different levels, so at the household level, at the neighborhood level, and creating a network of green, blue infrastructure in cities is really the way to go.
I would agree with you on the nature-based solutions as the way to go. Jaya, just as coming to you, you want to add something before I ask you the question?
I was going to ask you questions.
No, before you ask me, you're the one who's going to deliver the climate action plan for Bangalore. I mean, you're in the process of doing the draft report, etc. So give us a sense of where we are and what's your wish list to get the Bangalore's climate act, because the plan is just the first bit. Then there's the whole execution, implementation, metrics and the like. So where are we on this? And what is it that you would like to see? And we'll do a little shift in roles between what you play and I play. Because since there is no government representative, I offered to Jaya that I will be the proxy government. Having worked with government for 22 years, I will play a proxy government role to get a sense of what are the challenges if Bangalore is to put together a climate action plan that could work on the ground. Over to you, Jaya.
So to start with, I think what I'll do is I'll call out the elephant in the room, which is that the climate action plan is going to get done. It's going to get done brilliantly from our side, but it is not going to be a statutory document. Okay? So given that it is not going to be a statutory document, how do you rally stakeholders around this? How do you coordinate them together to deliver on the mandates and the recommendations of the action plan is a big thing, right? So the first is that, in terms of the wish list, and, this is also a question to you, Ravi, like, how do you rally the stakeholders together? The second is on institutional abilities. How do you institutionalize a plan like this, right? So Mumbai, for example, has the Climate Action Cell. What would that the equivalent for that be in Bangalore? Where would it sit? How could it be empowered with funds, functions, and functionaries, right? Not just have the plan. The third would be basically looking at data transparency. So there's a lot of data and the team has gone through and scrounged around over 25 agencies' data, scraped that to kind of build a first-time baseline inventory of all the emissions, of the GHG emissions. Now, for all of the actors to be held accountable, firstly, they'll have to make the data around their baselines transparent, around their targets transparent, and then how they're performing on those targets transparent, right? So how do we create that whole data repository? Where is it housed? How do we kind of enable that? Again, another question.
Don't go any further because this itself is one too many for government to handle. So, but let me start responding and then we'll go to your point
All
4
right.
and 5.
Sounds good.
So taking to the first one, beware of what you wish for. Because, you wanted it as a statutory document. The revised master plan CDP exercise is a statutory exercise, but we know what that has resulted in as a city. So just making it statutory per se is not necessarily going to fix it. As I see it, your bigger problem really is, it's a multiple agencies. I think you're talking to some 25 departments in government to put this together. There's the lack of data and all the stuff that you mentioned. So to my mind, this project has legs if it's only first politically embraced at the highest level. It has to be politically a commitment that this is important to us. And unless that messaging is done, you are going to be operating at the level of smaller officers across the system struggling to get, non-existent data in most cases and data that is of dubious quality should you get it. So my suggestion here, because for example, you're anchoring this with BBMP, I feel it's the wrong place to anchor it. Okay, I mean, you were saying let's deal with the elephant in the room. I'm also dealing with the elephant in the room. The reality is that unless, like the climate action cell, let's call it whatever one body that is out there, that needs to be at a very senior level who can knock heads of these 25 agencies together to deliver on the climate action plan. If it's not top down that way, it will be another report which will be said. We also have a report. Every year there'll be some metrics, 40 indicators, there will be some rating, but it's going to go nowhere. So unless there's an embracing of the idea at the highest level, followed by a climate action cell headed, and given bureaucratic setup, it'll have to be an additional chief secretary with additional charge maybe, but who is actually taking regular meetings and is the person you can escalate to should any department not play ball. Otherwise, this climate action plan is dead in the water. It is not going to go anywhere. It'll be a paper document, but it is unlikely because let's take the case of the comprehensive development plan. There are write-ups on transportation, there are write-ups on electricity, energy, and a whole lot of other departments. The departments don't even bother to read them, which is there as part of the city's comprehensive development plan. So what chance that they will accept this? And it will have to be embedded in the individual department. So BESCOM or BMTC, in every budgeting that they do, the climate action plan is not a quote that you can put on, saying I'm doing this for climate action plan. It has to be embedded internally in everything that they do, that climate action is considered for, taken for the equity point that he brought in. And that is only going to happen if it's embedded in the DNA of that silo of government agency. So I think the way to catch this is to basically figure out a way where from top down that signal is there, and there are questions repeatedly asked of the various departments that it is not sufficient for you to give me your figures for the state budget, but I want to specifically see the climate action component within what you're giving me. Unless that becomes part of year after year routine and half yearly and quarterly, I'm afraid that while it's desirable, it's a very good step that at least we'll have a document which documents some level of baseline and what we need to do. It will be another document which will go nowhere while our conditions get worse. And we're talking about nature-based solutions while we are concretizing the areas which are the routes to the lakes and the like. It's just the opposite of a nature-based solution for that particular area. So that really would be my coming back on data transparency. Jaya, it's going to be very difficult. We like to keep our data very close to our heart. We are opaque by design. I'm just playing a proxy role. And therefore, it's going to be a root canal operation to be able to extricate that data and put it out in the public domain. Because that transparency is inherently doesn't... You see, I think for that, what has to happen is, and he made that point in the context of Colombia, there is an inherent distrust between citizens and government. And the government needs to embrace the idea that I need to break down those trust barriers, distrust barriers, and build more trust. And to my mind, one of the no-brainers is to be more transparent with all the data and put it out in the public domain so that even entrepreneurs, as a tech capital, can find solutions once they have access to data. So the way to go ahead really is for the government to get convinced that the way to build a better trust and reduce the trust deficit with citizens is to go down that route, which again is aspects of behavioral change and trying to work it. It's a wicked problem, but that's the way to go. Do you have a 4 and 5?
Absolutely. I have 6 and 7 as well, if you'd like.
But anyway, quickly, there's 1 or 2, and then we'll open it to the questions.
Absolutely. So, I mean, just on the data, and Roger, I'll just come to you real quick. I mean, do you have an example of, cities where data transparency, where the opaqueness existed and then there were mechanisms by which data transparency was achieved and used for public good? Any thoughts, any examples?
From opaqueness to the transparency, right?
Or where transparently actually has benefited the city, putting the data out.
Let me quickly... The examples that are there are in contexts that are kind of less similar to the context of kind of Indian cities. I think a city like London has a real good track record in, being hyper transparent on the data of public services.
Yes.
And was not the case, 20 years ago. So reporting on the achievement. Oh, sorry. I'm very sorry for that. I used to be a musician and a singer, so I know how to use a mic.
So you promised us a little number at the end of this.
Well, we should discuss that first. No. So I think, for example, London, with the Greater London Plan that they developed in 2003, they really also chose to become hyper transparent about their data and about also the data. And this is not a reference to their the climate data, but the transport data, for example, throwing it out there and really be accountable for achieving their public transport goals. And that made them better, because it actually raised the bar and it put pressure on public authorities to to be accountable and to achieve their targets. So that's an example that I can.
I think SFO also has something similar. San Francisco.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So, and Ravi, back to you. I think on points number 4, 5, etc. I think one thing is that currently the cap is being developed for a certain jurisdiction, which is BBMP, which is why it is housed with the BBMP, right? And there are issues which transcend and don't obey administrative boundaries, like resources, your water, your air quality,
transportation
etc.
is a regional thing.
Exactly. So I think, the other question is, and the other thought is that how do you, once the plan is out, also there will be sort of these regional issues that we still need to tackle. We don't really have institutional mechanisms to deal with regional issues. What is your suggestion on how to tackle that?
I know the BMRDA is very weak in the Bangalore context, but the BMRDA is the logical partner to make that happen, because BMRDA is for the 8,000 square kilometer of the larger region, and also BIAPA and all these other authorities are supposed to report to them. So they have some convening power and an ability to push people under their jurisdiction. Just because it has been traditionally weak does not mean we throw in the towel. We can still figure it out and maybe use something like this cap and this crisis to actually strengthen institutions like that, which have a major role in the larger development of the state.
Right. And another thing is, about policy coherence, because once the cap is done, it doesn't end there. You mentioned the revised master plan exercise, which didn't go very far. But, if you just take the example of TOD, the city now has a TOD policy in place. We are very happy about that. But for that to actually become actionable, the master plan, the TOD policy, the comprehensive mobility plan, the cap will all need to talk to each other and they'll have to speak the same language.
Yeah.
How do we drive policy coherence?
So I wish I knew that's the toughest one, because already with these silos and getting anything done itself is a challenge. And now we have this new alphabet soup, the cap. So it's just another alphabet soup added to this whole mess. So this is really a tough one. To me, again, it all goes back to certain mindset changes. I've always maintained that politicians and bureaucrats need to embrace the idea of outcomes. Right now, they're still in some project mode. They're in a mode of, silos, my area, my responsibility. Putting the citizen at the center and thinking outcomes, because any outcome that the citizen want will invariably have at least 8 to 10 government agencies involved. So I think the bigger challenge to crack, and I really think we need some behavioral economists and the like to help us with all this stuff, is to get people to see that there is actually more value in thinking outcomes and delivering on them. And you take the credit for it, as opposed to these silo-based announcements of projects, which are really bridges to nowhere, and which is the chart that is that things are getting worse while they needed to be going down. I think, so it's a tough problem to crack, but that's not a reason to give up. We got to keep working and figuring it out. But I think it will require some kind of sagacity in the political leadership and a willingness of the bureaucratic apparatus to play ball.
All right. And I'll just end with one last one and then, over to audiences also. And this is, I'm going to sound like a broken record repeating this about capacity, right? Institutional capacity, departmental capacity, and on both ends, both in terms of numbers, the number of planners or engineers that we need for the city of this size, and also in terms of sort of their knowledge and kind of making it current, giving them the latest tools, and organizations like ours who go in with the intent of capacity building, And sometimes organizations like consultants who end up with capacity substitution walk out and then that capacity is gone, So I think on the capacity side, and there are many, many openings on the BBMP website. If you open the page, there are like 14 openings for planners. None of them have been filled. How do
Will you apply?
And that's the question, right? Like what
So you
what
have
would
your
make
answer
it?
there.
No, what would make it lucrative for me to apply, for Roger to apply?
So the point, Jaya, there on capacity planning, I know this is an overused word.
Yes.
I think came from the World Bank ages ago. It's difficult. And having worked with the system for over 2 decades, I mean, you can't build castles that will stand with the kind of sand and the material that's available. And you can upgrade to a limited extent, to the extent that they can take. My belief in this whole space is increasing cross-pollination between private and public. The boundaries need to, I really believe that the private sector needs to give 2-year sabbaticals or 5-year sabbaticals to its employees and say, go work in government. Government needs to create openings to receive them so that this side has a chance, bring their skill sets into government and this thing. Similarly, government employees at the mid and senior level need to be given sabbaticals and say, go work outside and come back. I really think that's the biggest silo which is worth breaking, another silo that's worth breaking. We need more osmosis because the talent exists as a collective. It just doesn't exist where it is. And in capacity building, the assumption is I can go build that capacity, which I don't think you can as someone who's worked with the system. I really believe crafting these kind of public-private initiatives, I don't call them PPP, but it's more initiatives where this kind of manpower, knowledge, project planning is fungible in a certain manner, is actually the way to go. And we need to create creative mechanisms. And actually, if industry is smart, this is what they should fund. If industry wants to make more money in Bangalore, they should fund this, maybe put behind 200, 300 people of this caliber, that I will fund their salaries, let them go work in government. That would be far more value for money than shouting from the rooftops that the place is not working. And the hidden thing in most corporates' balance sheet is the dysfunctional city. Their loss in productivity, apart from health and other indicators, doesn't show up on a balance sheet, but actually it is a major cost item, and they need to find smart ways. They have no option but to figure out how to make the city work if they want their business to prosper. And it is not CSR. CSR is like some corporate social, it is core business. Just like you care about raw material and people for your business, you better figure out how to make the city work if you want your business also to be more prosperous and retain the best talent in the city. That's how I would see it. So it requires interesting new juxtapositions about the way we think about standard constructs. I think we'll now throw it open to the audience. So there's a mic available, and if you could come up here, it's possible to get you on camera. So I suggest if you could just come here and ask the question. Thank you. Anybody wishing to ask questions can just come and stand by the side here. So we just save some time. Thank you.
Thanks, Ravi. I mean, I don't want to be as gloomy as you. But let me.
I thought it was optimistic.
You were. So just coming back to, I mean, and this is since you said building is one of the largest sectors. I mean, in India, I think we've seen a lot of progress. The code has been established. The sustainability chapter is a part of the code. So not only policy, but the next level is also in place. Now, I mean, Ravi was very generous when he talked about implementation. So how can we, governance, which is big. So how do we incentivize, because the sustainability code is, very good. It looks at a unit and then make sure that all elements of sustainability are there, light, water, electricity, everything. So how do we incentivize this in terms of, especially if you have examples from the global south, where by achieving this sustainability, there is an incentive. So,
specifically, you want to...
You can say it,
Yeah. Specifically on the building sector, right?
Building sector.
Yeah, I think, first of all, incentives, of course, lay in applying and incentivizing new built buildings to align with the labels and standards that are in place. There's a kind of a whole array of labels that kind of, have been sophisticatedly developed in order to let contractors build the most sophisticated, most energy efficient buildings. So that is one thing, and that works in the global south. We have the local and the national chapters, for example, of the Green Building Council that help us to develop that. The second is really looking at providing incentives at the household level. So see to what extent there are resources or subsidies available in order to upgrade housing. And we've seen that work also in the global south, in global cities, because especially if you utilize the power of individual owners, of homeowners, and especially asset managers, that can go a long way. So I think those are these incentives at the household level, at the asset management level, and applying labels and standards for achieving more sustainable buildings is one. Building codes, I mentioned already what the success that we had in Turkey and in Colombia to work with more advanced building codes at the national level, to really think about, what can we, in terms of building codes and building permits, what can we impose at the construction sector to kind of move from where we are right now into really creating more efficient buildings. They have been proven successful.
We have the code.
So a point he's saying is we have the code. How do we make sure people implement it and do it? So is it through incentives or through penalties?
Well, two things. Financial incentives is one, and the other thing is through the permits. So I don't know to what extent here in India the permit is linked, but especially by larger institutional investment and new buildings, the permit plays an important role.
Yeah, I think
What?
you can tell him about the OC process.
Later.
Okay, you can't. I'm now very excited or interested in what.
Then he just used another alphabet thing called the occupancy certificate.
Yeah.
So he says if the code is not followed, you will not get the occupancy certificate. He's very optimistic. There'll be a market for giving that.
Okay.
That's what I meant.
Okay, carry on, please.
Yeah, very good evening to the panel. Just last week, 3 latest news happened. One is sinkhole happened in Brigade Road. Parallelly, there is a sinking happening in Joshi Math town.
Yeah.
And one.
Well, we had done some studies for Bangalore as well. And, there is a certain sort of subsidence that is happening in Bangalore as well. And hopefully I'm not raising alarms to say that this is going to be, Joshimath 2.0, but just to say that subsidence, because of the way and the nature of what we are developing and where we are developing it, it is causing a lot of pressure on the land and the land capacity. So I think that is something, and in Bangalore, it's about, I think when we had done it was about 1.23 centimeters per year was sort of the subsidence that we were having in the city, right? So that is what's happening here. Joshi Math, I really do not want to comment on that because there are a lot of, and there's a committee that's been established and there are a lot of studies that will happen. There were studies that were done 30 years ago about what needs to happen, what needs to be curbed in the town. Apparently those studies, and the recommendations weren't followed, and so therefore we are in this kind of situation. The rare earth materials, I don't know. Have you heard of that? The rare earth materials that have been discovered in Sweden.
And they say that could be game changer for green technology.
We have to wait
But
and see.
still,
It's too early days here. Don't go by one press announcement. Would be my recommendation.
Yeah.
Come, please.
Thank you for that wonderful
Yes, Pulta.
panel. I have 2 unrelated questions. So my first question is, how is the climate cell different from the State Environment Board or MOFCC, where you can go and ask for environment impact assessments? So what are the roles differentiated in terms of assessment of climate impacts? And what are the kind of powers that the climate cell as an agency hosted in BMC hold over the multitude of agencies, financial as well as bureaucratic? That's one question. And the second question is on the, which was kind of your question towards the end, but I would like answer from WRI, where at the moment we have TOD, we have CMP, we have Bangalore Master Action Plan developed by 3 different agencies. We have the tree consensus case going on in High Court for like decades now, and we still have not been able to get that data. So then how does WRI as an agency which is outside the government framework see the implementation of climate action plan?
Great. So on your first question on the climate action cell, I think our imagination, and here's what we are doing in Mumbai, I think Roger had mentioned this. So essentially, the climate action cell will be for the city of Bangalore. It is not going to be a state level entity, right? So it is going to be for the city of Bangalore. Second, the main function of the climate action cell is going to be coordination across agencies so that, the goals of all of these agencies can be aligned towards the targets that everyone sort of agrees on, right? Through the recommendations of the climate action cell. So the climate action cell is not envisioned as much as, being a completely technical arm or a technical authority as much as it is, envisioned as an administrative coordinating authority across, agencies. In terms of the teeth, and that's where I said that, for this climate action cell to be, this whole concept of the climate action cell as an institution to be successful, it will have to be empowered at the highest level with funds, with functions, with functionaries. Just by instituting a cell saying, here, now go coordinate and, figure out this whole mess and, talk to 25 departments, that can't happen unless you actually empower that cell. So I think empowering that cell and at the highest level, and I think Ravi mentioned this, for example, at the chief minister level. So at the highest level for that interest to kind of become apparent, for them to empower that cell is what is needed for it to be able to do its job. So that's your question one. On the second one, about basically, the coherence between plans. I think that is going to be the trickiest issue, right? How do you drive policy coherence in this current atmosphere? In my mind, I think the upside that I see or the hope that I see is that all of these departments have actually participated in the preparation of the climate action plan itself and its recommendations. So while BBMP is the anchoring nodal agency, all of the departments by proxy are ratifying this plan. Okay, they're agreeing to it, they're buying into it, and their recommendations. So one would expect that all of their actions would therefore follow and will be in sync with what the climate action plan is saying. And therefore, over time, and this is not going to happen overnight, it's not going to happen in the next 6 months probably, but over time, all of the policies will start to align and coalesce around common city objectives and goals.
Hi, good evening. Jaya, actually, continuation to the previous question, actually. I work very closely with the pollution control boards because we work with water and recycling. I sort of feel that pollution control board has a lot of power, like, the state and central, and if you look at NGT, green tribunals, whatever it is. Because most of climate action is either construction or you're looking at transportation, mobility, right? And their causes or sources of pollution. And if there were powers given to the pollution control board, like how the National Green Tribunal has powers, like a central department that can overrule anything that happens in the state, is that not a starting place for the climate action plan to be housed at or given powers to instead of probably BBMP? Because we all know what BBMP is capable of, but like we've really seen pollution control board being a very powerful agency. Your opinions on that? No,
you're absolutely right, and Shrimo, you can probably chime in over here as well. But I think, the Pollution Control Board definitely has a lot of powers, but whether or not the climate action plan should be housed within the Pollution Control Board is a question, right? Again, it's a state level authority. And then, when you start looking at imperatives specifically for, Bangalore and, Bangalore as a city, what is that agency which can take ownership and answerability? And right now, I don't have a better answer than, BBMP, and also going from the Mumbai example where, the plan is situated and housed with the MCGM. That's where it is right now, right? But in terms of the authority that it has, the fact that it has say over a lot of things, whether it's energy, whether it's buildings, whether it's transport, it has say over, all of this, because from the air pollution, land pollution, all of this, mitigative aspects, I think they're a very crucial and important player in the city, and they will be very important in terms of taking this climate action plan forward.
Only thing is in Bombay, energy and transport are with the municipal corporation. That's not the case here. So
yes.
Slightly complex.
Yes.
I think you wanted to.
Hi, good evening. My actually question is to the government, but since we don't have any,
That's Ravi.
I'm happy to answer.
representatives, if you can be the proxies for them, please. So my question is, we run a company where we facilitate the supply of treated wastewater, and we use this for construction. So, for example, the metro construction that was happening in Bangalore used to take fresh water for every construction activity they used. But from the time we started the company and from the time we pitched to them, they said, we'll try with the wastewater. But I know it has been an uphill task to go and approach these bodies, for the government to put in regulations in place. So my question is, what could we do and who could we approach so that these policies could be set up and we could actually facilitate this service quickly, faster, more
So
efficiently?
is the only way to get the treated wastewater done through regulation and mandate,
Right.
or is there a business case itself to use the treated wastewater? Because if you have the latter, then the need for the former becomes less. Because if everything is going to be dependent on a mandate and a regulation, it leads to its own circle of non-compliance and a price for that non-compliance being paid.
But I'm thinking like if it's a top-down approach, like if you already have like the biggest body certifying that, maybe this should be the way forward, isn't it easier for its implementation?
In theory, yes, but in practice, like that, there are so many regulations which are being followed in the, absence. They don't do it.
Okay.
So just doing that, so many of these cases, actually it's better to make the business case why they're better off using that treated water out there,
Right.
rather than relying on the government to make that as a mandated policy. That's going to be a much longer haul.
Okay, thank you.
And I'll just add like a pointer here, if I may. So I think, one of the things is that, with government, we've seen with MSMEs and businesses like yours, procurement is a big challenge, right? How do you participate in that process itself? So I think that is one thing that needs to be ironed out on their side. But I think making the business case for it, like Ravi is saying, is going to be very important. And then, looking at how standards can change, in terms of the building construction standards, where a certain percentage of treated wastewater is required or to be used in all buildings. I think, there's the standards part of it that needs to change. There's the business case that you need to make, and then parallelly the procurement process, which needs to be modified for your business to succeed.
Thank you.
That'll be the last question, and then we can talk after the session.
My name is Priyanka Krishnan and I'm an architect. So my doubt was with regards to stormwater management. So we know that with the softer side of how to deal with stormwater in terms of sustainable drains. So using bioswales and so on. But when I read in the newspaper, like there is the concreting of the nalas, which is required to help us mitigate flood management. So how do we as citizens, like if we join as part of organizations which work with this, like WRI, I think we do get an opportunity to work on this, but otherwise as citizens, what can we do when we know there is a better approach to this? How do we connect with the government and tell our solution that could be considered?
Ravi, I'm going to request you to change your hats back to Ravi and answer that.
No, actually, it's a very good question. This is really, you have to keep working at it and build coalitions on the ground to get them to see your point of view. Like he said, the nature-based solutions, don't over-concretize. Because by concretizing the drain, the only message you're sending is, you're telling the low-lying areas, I'm going to send water your way faster.
Correct.
Which is actually against all basic principles of what the stormwater drain should do. It should soak up to the extent possible out there, even the approach to it. It's quite commonsensical that needs to be done. Unfortunately, there is a certain business model in concretizing the drains and a whole lot of things associated with it. That's what we are up against at one level. So it's not just the science tells you that there's a better way to do it, but the economics of that place in terms of the projects determine something else. So you will need to build local resistance points and local bodies, people coming together and using various mechanisms to make sure. It's a struggle. It is not, we don't do the right things automatically. So that's the only thing I can say.
Well, I can add to it because there is also a positive, just a positive reference to that. I think civic action is increasingly important to help the government to shape their policies in the right direction. And we see as WRI, and we are very much aware of that, we see that the way that we collaborate also with civic groups in order to drive agendas is very important. On the prize for, I showed the prize for cities. The former winner of the prize for cities is the city of Rosario in Argentina. And it's very interesting to see how a civic group started with small urban agriculture interventions, developed a real movement out of nature-based solution, marketplaces, urban agriculture, education, which became, and similar to what we've seen in Barranquilla, which became actually so convincing and so powerful that it became an approach that was supported by policy, was supported by the municipal authorities. It became, and in that sense, there is really a shared responsibility. In that sense, very good points to end on.
Thank you.
There's one more thing that I'd like to add, the last thing, in terms of, what can WRI do? And I think what we can do is provide the evidence, right? To say that this is better than business as usual. We can provide the science and the economic evidence to say over the life cycle, this approach, a hybrid approach, is better than the concretized approach. Where you take that is really up to the public groundswell.
Thank you.
Thank you. So on this note, we'll close. We're slightly out of time already. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. Thank you, Roger, for that excellent lecture. And thanks, Jaya.